Well, last week we looked at John number 1, which means today is time for John number 2, which is John the Apostle John, as we would normally refer to him. He was the son of a fisherman. He was a fisherman. And the younger brother, presumably the younger brother of the Apostle James, who also makes, well, I guess it doesn't make him the youngest, but he's presumably the youngest of the apostles as well, all of the 12. He is known sometimes as the apostle of love, but really I guess maybe his legacy is in the epitaph, it's kind of an epitaph, scriptural epitaph, the disciple whom Jesus loved is what he's called. Now, I don't think it takes away at all that he is the one that gave himself that epitaph, because it's in the Gospel of John where he's referred to as that. In other words, Matthew, Mark, or Luke never call him that. But so it's not a braggadocious thing, but he does refer to himself as that for some reason. We could probably spend a decent amount of time just on that. What exactly was it? And by the way, there's no real answer to this question. This is just food for thought. What was it that led John to call himself the disciple whom Jesus loved? Because clearly he loved all of them, even Judas, in a way, and as far as that goes. But there was something special about John that led him, and before I even say anything else, I'll open up the possibility that John didn't mean anything by it at all. But it was just a way for him to not say his own name. Because John never says I in his gospel. He never says, he doesn't even say, and by the way, that was me. He gets real close at the end when he says, this is the disciple who is bearing witness about these things. In other words, the person who's writing this, that's the person who's writing this. Right after he tells the thing about Jesus tells him by what kind of death he was to glorify God, and then it says Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them. He turned around and he saw the disciple whom Jesus loved, and he said, well, what about him? You know that story. And Jesus says, don't worry about him. I've got something for him. I got something for you. But then he says, this is the disciple who's writing this. So whoever wrote the gospel that we called the Gospel of John is the disciple whom Jesus loved. And by deduction, it has been understood that it was John. John wrote the fourth gospel, and John, we know that whoever wrote the fourth gospel is the disciple whom Jesus loved, but we have pieced together and deduced that it's John, who again is presumably the youngest of the 12. But he nevertheless, maybe he didn't mean anything by it because Jesus loves everybody, or maybe there is something there.
Where does the presumption that he's the youngest of the 12 come from?
Probably because he is, again, I should probably say presumably, the last one that lived, that he lived. If the late dates of John and Revelation are true, then that means that he lived he lived 60 years after Jesus died. So my understanding is that is probably the main piece of evidence that leads people to assume that he was the youngest, because Not just because he lived the longest, because the reason he lived the longest is because they were all killed. But because he lived so long, traditionally at least, after the others died, that would have made him so young at the time that he was likely the youngest. But
So he was possibly in late teens or early 20s.
could have been, yeah. Could have been a teenager when he was fishing out on the boat with big brother James and dad Zebedee, and they left the boats. Could have been a teenager at that time. Very well, could have been. Could have been his early 20s. And I say could have been. He probably was around that age. If the late dates are correct, and I think the evidence would suggest that they are. So if that would mean that he wrote Revelation around the middle of the AD 90s. So Jesus died in 30. Not 33, by the way. He was 33, but he died in the year 30. That's what, 6 years between Jesus' death and John writing a Revelation. So he would have had to have been very young when he started following Jesus. Yep.
Actually, all of John's books were written later. But you know, in Galatians, when it says that now that you have come to know God, or rather, be known by God, when you have a chance, which John did, to look back at the life of Jesus, the cross, what he taught him, what he did, John realized how much Jesus loved not only him, but all of us. I mean, sometimes, you know how kids, they go, well, you love her more than you love me. I mean, there's always that. Which kid do you like best? Tommy and Dick's mothers used to always do that as a routine. But in this particular thing, when we sing, yes, Jesus loves me, this I know. It doesn't take anything away from what John said. It's just the more you realize that the love of the Lord belongs to each of his children.
Yeah.
It means a lot.
Yeah, and John had a unique opportunity to be with Jesus as a full-time job. I mean, that's what it means when they left their nets and followed him. They quit their day job. They quit their jobs just to be with Jesus all the time. Is what it seems to suggest. I don't know when they would have had time to go back fishing again. I mean, considering that everything we read from that point on, they were permanent disciples of Jesus. And they were supported by the, different people who showed them hospitality. And part of that would be feeding them. And so they kind of were, here and there and all over the place with Jesus. But John probably, I can't help but think he would have reflected over the years and remembered things that not just Jesus giving his life, but all kinds of little things that he did that was all out of his love for them. Like, oh, that thing, I remember that day, that thing that he did was for us. And, that thing that he did, and everything, basically, that Jesus did showed how much he loved not just humankind, but those 12 men of which he was one. Yeah, Dean?
Well, too, it seemed like Jesus had a special mission for him besides the other apostles. God was acting, he was the one that was chosen, and we know that at that time the children were to take care of the parents, and we know that he chose John, and also that John was going to live longer, and that was the reason that he chose John to take care of his brother. And, it seemed like for whatever reason, he had chosen John to do that.
Yeah.
He did it on his own. It wasn't, the fact that John was the most beloved of the apostles that he was. He was just like the apostle, like you said. But Jesus had another mission for him, and that was something that they would be the ones that would be logical for him to take care of his mother.
Yeah.
So I mean, like you said, there's so many reasons why he say that, why he chose John, it don't make any difference.
Yeah.
He just did.
Yeah, which that says some, I mean, among all the speculation, it still says something about John. Something. And I think it's probably, there's something more to it than just he was going to live the longest. Because, just because he's going to live a long time doesn't mean he would have been a good man to take care of his mom. And as far as we know, his half-brothers, we don't have any record of them dying, being killed, super prematurely. So they would have been the natural ones you'd think of to go to take care of their own mother. But for whatever reason, the firstborn, Jesus, put her in the care of this disciple, this apostle. So, yeah. Yeah, James, you mean, the pillar, I think is what you're thinking of. Yeah, there's a lot of questions there, but still, there's something about John. There's clearly something there about John. Maybe, yeah. I think the only thing that I can think of as to why he didn't choose his brothers is because they didn't believe in him at that time. But that still doesn't answer the question of why he picked John of everybody else. And I don't think it was just because he was the one that was there, physically there, because he was, but it's probably more than that. So when we look at John, he's one of the apostles that we see more of than others, because he was in that inner, what we kind of call the inner circle, the three. Somebody already mentioned, about favorites. I don't know if Jesus had favorites, but he did have categories. And I think we've looked in the past about when the apostles are listed. There's a couple variations. I think there's 3 lists, maybe 4. The fourth one, the last one's in Acts, I guess maybe John doesn't give a list, but there's another list in Acts or something like that. Or maybe the other way, maybe Luke doesn't have one. At any rate, there's a little variation, but there's these 4 groups that are the same every time. So the first group is always Peter, James, and John. And there's those 3 different occasions recorded in the New Testament where Jesus permitted only Peter, James, and John to come. Remember what they were? Transfiguration, the garden, and then Jairus' daughter. That's the one the harder one to remember, because, the garden, obviously, that's a very big occasion, and then the Mount of Transfiguration, but then the raising of Jairus' daughter. So, again, questions like, why did he not want the other ones to come? Well, we don't know the answer, but the ones he did says something about those 3. Maybe he had the most expectations from them, or the most high hopes, for lack of a better word. But at any rate, it says a lot about John that he was one of the 3, even though if he actually was the youngest, really says a lot about him. Joe, do you have something?
Well, see, I think the parable of the talents explains what's going on. Some people appreciate more his teachings, look who was asking the questions, who wanted to know more, who. It's kind of like you stick like glue to somebody who's going to explain appreciating. And that's what I think of when I see whom Jesus loved. I think it's John appreciating how much the Lord loved personally him, and how much when we're at the table, we should personally appreciate how much he's done for us.
Yeah.
We can't comprehend everything. Just can't wrap our brain around it, but as much as we can.
I see John, my impression is quiet, more or less. Almost the counterpart to Peter. And that may just be my imagination. But
He was the son of thunder.
yeah, we're going to get to that. Yeah.
So
He
it didn't come up.
he was maybe as the youngest, if he was the youngest. You know how Job's fourth friend that doesn't even get mentioned until he starts talking. He was there the whole time, but he didn't say anything because that was just the way of things. He was the youngest. He understood that even though I'm sure he was an adult, obviously he was a man, but I'm going to let the men, the older ones, speak, and I'm going to sit here until he couldn't take it anymore. But maybe John was kind of like that, at least as far as the other apostles were, and especially maybe the inner circle there, where he sat back, he soaked everything in, but that's not to say that he wasn't bold at the same time. So, a couple things about John, and we'll look at a few highlights where he pops up. He was a native of Bethsaida in Galilee. His parents, it is believed that they were related to Jesus. Now, they may not have been, again, 50-50, whether he was or wasn't. But it is believed that they may have been cousins of some kind. His mother followed Christ, ministered to Christ, was at the cross, and was among those who went to anoint Jesus' body after he was put into the tomb. His father was a fisherman, had his own fishing vessel, had apparently a very successful business, enough to have hired servants also working out there with him. He himself was a successful fisherman. He was called to discipleship whenever he was tending to his nets on the beach there on the shore. Again, it's presumed he was the youngest of the disciples. The author here calls him the Benjamin of the 12. If you know the story of Jacob's sons, then you'll understand that reference. The Benjamin of the 12. He was one of that inner circle. He was surnamed by Christ as a son of thunder because of his prophetic zeal and his resolution to really testify and defend Christ. He was treated by Jesus with greater familiarity than the others enjoyed, according to this writer at least. He sat next to Jesus at the Last Supper. He was in a place of honor, he was in Jesus' bosom, as the words put it, which doesn't make any sense to us the way we would sit at a table. But the thing is, they didn't sit at a table the way we sit at a table, and we won't get into all that. But he was in the place directly in front of Jesus to where he would lean back. He would have to, sort of lean back to whisper to Jesus whenever Peter motioned to him, said, ask him who he's talking about. He was entrusted with the care of Jesus' mother. He died when he was almost 100 years old, according to this estimate. And he wrote the Gospel of John, 3 little Johns, 2 really little Johns, 1 little John, and also the book of Revelation. But here's some things where he pops up that we can learn a little bit about his progression. His call in Matthew 4 and Luke 5, I think, would also fit into that. He is called as he's fishing. Immediately they leave their nets. Of course, this was just the call to permanent discipleship, because we could go back even farther to John 1, and even though there's no proof, I believe that the most likely thing is that John was one of the two of John's disciples, the baptizer, who followed Jesus whenever John said, "Behold the Lamb of God." So we know it was Andrew, Peter's brother, and another disciple. And based on John's custom of not naming himself, it seems that whenever he says, John was standing with two of his disciples, and the two disciples heard him say this, and they followed Jesus. And he says, where is it? He says, one of the two who heard John speak and followed was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. Okay, well, what about the other one? Why didn't he tell us his name? Well, stands to reason. The reason he didn't tell him his name is because it's him. And he didn't like doing that for whatever reason. And I think we could understand why a man of humility would not want to do that. But that doesn't seem to be when they permanently started following Jesus. So Matthew 4 is when they quit their jobs. But then, he may fade into the background a little bit, and we turn to Matthew, let's see, to get it chronologically. I should have had these in chronological order. In Mark 10, is Mark 10? Let me double check that. If that's before the transfiguration, it's after. So transfiguration would be next, where he goes up to the mountain and he takes Peter, James, and John. And they get to see Moses and Elijah. They don't get to talk to them. Jesus was talking to them. They didn't get to talk to him. John got to hear that. So John was part of that where, they said, why do the scribes say that Elijah's got to come? I think maybe one big question they were asking is, why did Elijah just leave? Because the scribes say that Elijah's supposed to come before the day of the Lord. So I think what they were wondering is, why did he just leave? Because he just got here. And Jesus said, well, he explains to them, that prophecy is about John the Baptizer. John the Apostle was part of that. Then, a couple of things that may seem out of character for John. And the reason they seem out of character for John is kind of proves a point that we're going to make here at the end about sort of a last thing that we could take from him about his transformation. Because I think John underwent maybe not as dramatic a transformation as Peter did, but I think he did undergo a transformation of character. Because the times when he is singled out, more or less, or with him and his brother, it's not the most flattering thing. So in Mark 10, in fact, I think I'm still out of order. But in Mark 10 is when James and John come up to Jesus and say, give us the place at your right hand and left hand when the day comes. Let us sit at your right and your left. That took some boldness and maybe a high thought of self to request that. Maybe a lack of humility to an extent. And naturally, when the 10 heard it, it says they were indignant. This made them mad that James and John did that. So that seems to suggest this was not some humble mistake of lack of thoughtfulness or whatever, but there was intention behind asking this because it made them angry when they found out about it. But another time was whenever they are going through the village of Samaria, who would not give Jesus they wouldn't let him stay there. And this made James and John very angry. And they said, would you like us to call fire from heaven to come down upon them? And that's when Jesus, it seems, was a time when they showed themselves to be the sons of thunder. Fiery. They were fiery. But that sounds weird for John, doesn't it? Because when we think of John, we think of the John that wrote the Gospel of John. and the John that wrote 1 John, especially the John that wrote 1 John 4, which has led him, along with his gospel, to be called the apostle of love, because he talked about love all the time. Almost all of Jesus' quotes that have love in it are in John. And even John 3:16, which is arguably not even Jesus' words. The text could go either way. Whether Jesus said it or whether John is saying it, it's still recorded by John. John's the one that recorded, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son." And then 1 John is full of things about love. Loving one another. This is how much God loved us, that he sent his Son. And he loved us so much that he gave his life for us. And on and on and on about love and love and love and calling on my little children. And it seems like this there's definitely a transformation that took place. I'm just going to go ahead and pop all these up there. But the one I skipped was when John told on himself. And I'm going to try to find it. Because I know I have it written here, but I don't know which one it is. Dean, do you have something? You can go ahead and...
Well, there's one report that it was the mother of James and John came to Jesus to ask him that, or am I thinking of something else? I thought I used to say something that their mother came to Jesus to ask him about your faith. Am I thinking wrong on that?
What is it again?
Oh,
Oh, one of the Gospels says their mom.
mom, that's one. So either way, it doesn't matter.
Mom was with them, obviously, yeah.
The request was made that whether they did it themselves too, and then the mom or emphasized it more, but anyway, it did happen.
Yeah, I think it's recorded in 3, at least 2, but I think 3, and 2 of them, only one of them mentions their mom. So that leads me to believe that they were the primary and she was with them. Now, if it was the other way around, 2 said that their mom came and 1 said James and John, then I would say their mom was the main, the leader in that, and they kind of were at her heels or whatever. But since 2 of them don't even mention their mom, I think they were the ones that this was their idea. And of course, mom likes the idea. Her 2 boys, they deserve, of course, to be at the right hand and the left. Yes.
I just think it goes without saying that all Christians are transferred or transformed by the Word of God. Paul, basically, I have learned in whatsoever state I am, therewith to be content.
Mm-hmm.
And then again in Philippians, it's like, whatever I've done in the past, forget it. I pressed on to the goal. And all of them would say, none of them attained it before they were called home. I mean, we do it for little children. Maybe that's why we have to go back to be little children. If you read your Bible and pray every day, you'll grow, grow, grow. If you don't read your Bible and pray every day, you'll shrink, shrink, shrink.
Yeah.
And no matter how old you get, that's true. And I love the song for the rest, for everybody who's listening. He's still working on you. Give me time. And we expect people to come. Moses' son, you came. And he said, too many Christians expect people to come like Christians in a box, where all you do is just add water. You expect them to come perfect, you expect them to come, and you just add the water and you're ready to go.
Yeah.
And how we got that concept, I don't know.
I don't either. But the account I was looking for is actually they're right in a row. The two other ones, they're right in a row. I didn't realize they were right in a row in Luke chapter 9. Do you want us to call down fire from heaven is right after the other one, the other incident with John, and that's when John is compelled all of a sudden to say, we saw somebody casting out demons in your name, and we stopped him because he's not with us. And Jesus said, don't stop him, for the one who is not against you is for you. Now, I don't want to get too caught up on the details of that, but just the fact that John was at least bold enough and he was zealous enough. It may not be as extreme as what he did next, recorded next in that village of Samaria. You want us to tell fire from heaven to come down and consume them? That shows a little bit about John, and I guess just like his big brother James, a little bit about their character. They had good intentions, but they were passionate.
Then the three on the inner circle, all three of them had, because Peter definitely had passions. I mean, he was intense about the stuff he did.
Yeah.
Even if he was wrong, so the three of them kind of had that similar characteristic that just needed to be molded into.
Yeah, they had similarities. Even though I say that John was the kind of the counterpart, he did have similarities. But later, he seems to have taken just as much of a turn as, in other words, the John who wrote 1 John would not have said, Lord, do you want us to call down fire from heaven to consume them? That's the point I'm trying to make. Yeah, he learned. Yeah.
Characteristic, and that might be the word that's the tripper, is because you think of a characteristic as something something you were born with, something that you just came wired for.
Yeah.
Whereas,
Which that is a thing,
yeah,
but not everything.
that's
Yeah.
not what this is.
Yeah.
He had to grow. Okay, yeah, some people are born a character. Right?
Well, so there are some things some traits that are ingrained in us, but not in the sense of I can't grow. Not to the extent that I can say I was born this way and I'm always going to be this way.
Right.
There are things that we can outgrow, and we can overcome, we can overgrow, and I think that's why the seed there for Peter and James and John, they didn't outgrow the seed. They took control of it. And that may be why they were the three that Jesus, the three inner circle, because they had that fire in them that just needed to be under control. Because fire is a very powerful thing and a very dangerous thing, but once it's under control, any dangerous thing that's under control, it's a very good thing. It can be a very good thing. Anything. I guess I should say it the other way around. Anything that's a thing that's out of control is very dangerous. But once it's under control, it can be very useful. Not only not dangerous, but very useful. And that's what Peter had, and I think that's what James and John had.
Is that what weakness is? Power under control.
It has been defined that way, yeah. Not weakness, but it's not a lack of strength. It's just an even greater strength to control that maybe impulse that we might have. Yeah, Dean?
Same like, before even Jesus chose Peter, James, and John, they were recognized as the sons of thunder. So, I mean, the talk about it even before that, it seems to me that, what it was before this, that they were recognized as the sons of thunder and whatever.
Yeah. That definitely showed that name was appropriate. Yeah, some of this. I think all three of these instances of, or at least these two. Do you want us to call fire down from heaven? And do you want, we made them stop because they weren't with us. That was the main thing that he emphasized there. It's not that they were faking it, because he said they were casting out demons in your name. They were actually doing it. But we told them to stop because they weren't one of us. They weren't part of our crew, our 12, us here, these closest to Jesus, Jesus said, don't do that anymore. And then the other about let us sit at your right hand and your left hand. Those three kind of show their personality and their traits and kind of contribute to Jesus. Yeah, that was perfectly appropriate. Sons of thunder, fiery, passionate, zealous, and those are good traits. But those few little blips just are kind of examples of when they let it get out slip away from their own mastery, if you will. And that's why I say he changed. He had the same kind of transformation that Peter did, and I think probably James too. We just didn't get a chance to learn much more about James because he's the first one that was killed, that was murdered before the first apostle, before we even see much of him. But who do we read about for the first 11 chapters or so of the book of Acts, or 8 chapters? We read about Peter and John. Peter, even before James is murdered, who was it? Beginning in chapter, 9, and then especially in chapter 13, it's all Paul. Luke's with Paul. So when we think of the book of Acts, we think of Paul. But who was it before that? Peter and John. Peter and John. Peter and John went to the temple. They were preaching. They got arrested. They were thrown in prison. They got set free. Peter and John preaching. It was Peter and John that gave that big speech about we ought to serve God rather than men, obey God rather than men. It was Peter and John that gave the big speech about there is salvation in no one else, no other name under heaven by which we must be saved. That was Peter and John. So we may say that was Peter, but it was Peter and John. So John was right there with him. It was John that was following Jesus when he was arrested that had to go get Peter and drag him in. John was the one who seemed to be less afraid than Peter even was. So maybe he was quieter to some extent, but that was not to say that he was not bold and zealous and passionate, and got him his nickname from Jesus. When you turn to 1 John, you see what seems to be a different man. Not that the other man was just so horrendous, but a different spirit, if you will. That fiery zeal is more been molded into a warmth of love for mankind, souls, and especially Christians. And that's why that endearing, my little children. He viewed the church and the members of the church as little children, his little children, in his teaching. So seems to be soft and warm and tender and gentle, and yet just as zealous for the truth as he ever had been. So that's John the Apostle, as much as we can say about him anyway. Just for a fun fact, well, I say fact, may not be fact at all. Tradition says that he was thrown into a vat of boiling oil to be killed, but survived it. So that he would have, obviously, if that's true, if that actually happened, he would have been quite disfigured after that. But the Lord wasn't kidding whenever, ironically, how he said, what's it to you if I want him to go on living and living and living, for until I come again or whatever? That's nothing to you. Well, John did go on and on living and serving God for a very long, serving the Lord for many, many years to the very end. Dean, do you have something else? Okay. All right. Well, hopefully we did him justice as much as we can in 45 minutes or whatever. The thing about anytime we talk about Peter or John or anybody who had a transformation should be an encouragement to us, like we just mentioned, like Joe just mentioned. There are traits that we have that can be our weaknesses or they can be our strengths. It can be, I guess you could say any trait we have can be a weakness or a strength. Being more on the quieter side can be a strength because you are less likely to get yourself in trouble by opening your mouth. At the same time, it can be a weakness because it can be more difficult for you to open your mouth when you should. And the reverse is equally true. If you're not on the quieter side, you may be more likely to get yourself in trouble by speaking. But instead of dialing it back and being calculated. Yes?
Who was the one that Jesus referred to? Nathanael, in whom there is no guile.
Yeah, Nathaniel.
Which, it's interesting that Jesus knows the intent of the heart. Some people get in trouble because they're impulsive. They're already in hot water before they realize it. But there was no intent. So I think, I was just trying to sort out, because we all need to fight to change, and we need to develop an integrity that others recognize. So there are some things you're born with, and the intent is the only thing I can figure out.
Only thing you can figure out what?
What you're born with,
Oh,
the intent,
okay.
a heart.
You're born with the intent?
Well,
There are things that we're born with. But yeah, we can develop our natural traits that are good, and we can try to overcome any traits that we have that are not good, and we can tweak any traits that could be either one. If it leans this way, it's not such a good trait. If it leans this way, it is a good trait. You have to strive to tweak it to the good side, just like that zeal that James and John had. He never lost his zeal, but he was more calculated with the funnel that he put it through. So no more of, they don't want you to stay here? Well, let's burn it to the ground. No, let's show them love and patience and try to help them more than destroy them.
it's basically summarized in that prayer, serenity prayer. The courage to change the things that need to be changed, and the ability to accept the things that cannot be changed, and the wisdom to know the difference.
Yeah. That might be the hardest part, the knowing the difference. And once we know the difference in each individual case, I guess, that's where the strength to accept it or to make the change. John, he made some changes, I think. He didn't get himself in trouble as much as Peter did, but he did have that fire in him. He didn't call Peter the son of thunder. He called John that. So he clearly made some changes, and anybody that does that is just proof that it's possible. So anything that we struggle with in our lives, we can overcome, and we can. You don't have to become a totally different person, but just learn more, gain wisdom in how in what you do and don't do, and the filter that we should see things through. As long as we look through Jesus, which I think is what made the difference for Peter and John. They learned from him. They learned how to deal with those things, and what's most important is the salvation of souls. And Jesus gave his life for that. And so far be it from us to ruin that potential outcome for people because of our behavior, our prejudice, or anything like that.